So yeah, we are live.
So how to do that? Recording oneself. So here is the record. I can do it that way. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So welcome to the plenary session on 16th, afternoon of 16th. This is the last day of our conference, and we have had great learning experience so far. And I hope that we continue to learn and from our distinguished speakers in this session as well. So our first speaker is Dr. Enakshi Ray Mitra. She is a senior professor at the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. The title of her paper is Remedying Conceptual Confusions about Action and Intention in Two Specific Cases, Manslaughter and Acts of Sexual Violence. Ma'am, over to you.
Thanks. With a brief thanks to the organizers, I'll go straight into my paper. As you see, just a first clarification and a correction. The title of my paper is Philosophical Counselling on Action and Intention based on Austin's treatment of a specific case of manslaughter. There were two issues first, but then I had corrected because I thought that time and space would not permit me to handle two issues. So this is the one issue that I will be, I will be handling. To go to the next slide, I'm sorry, can you please help me because okay, right. Yeah, so as you see, sorry, the plan of this paper is that it is not about philosophical counseling, but it is an attempt to apply the method to a particular litigation. And I've drawn from Austin's treatment of this litigation named Regina versus Finney, Shrewsbury Assizes 1874. Here, the agent of manslaughter was declared to be innocent of any culpable negligence and intention to kill the victim. Yes, so a proper mechanism of philosophical counseling can help both the jury and the convict to recast the vacuous descriptions of unintentional actions into a more substantial and enriched reality of intentional negligence and clumsiness. And hereby it can also ensure a positive and responsible reconstrual of the common notions like empathy and efficiency, which were palpably missing in this particular context. This may also reasonably enable the potential counselees to revamp the ethical orientation of their actions. Here are the bare facts about the litigation. You see, a prisoner was kept in a lunatic asylum and entrusted with the regular duty of giving a hot bath every day to a particular mental patient named Watkins. One morning, after Watkins had finished his bath, the prisoner, that was his attendant, he asked him to come out so that he could clean the bath and make it ready for the next use. Now, a series of events happened. The prisoner's, that is the attendant's, attention was diverted by a new attendant from the next cubicle asking him something. He told Watkins to come out of the bath, but omitted to check out whether he had really come out. And lastly, he mistakenly turned on only the hot tap for cleaning. As a result, Watkins was scalded to death. The prisoner's action was finally judged to be unintentional, and he was declared not guilty. Next slide, please. In that case, you see, if we think of a counterfactual situation where the legal judgment declares the agent to be guilty, not of murder, but of criminal negligence, in this counterfactual situation, the exercise of philosophical counseling would be more effective and directly enable the agent of manslaughter, harboring any illusion about his innocence, come to terms with the judgment. I have not presented the convict as the counselee, but I have posed a person as the counselee who, with reference to this particular case and his legal judgment, would be motivated to take a theoretical or conceptual interest in the relation between the action and intention, or in the intentional-unintentional dichotomy. But in the case of our account, as we go on with this dialogical exercise, we can hopefully appreciate that with the necessary elaborations and amplifications, All these elaborations are not allowed with the paucity of time and space. This dialogical exposition will be available to the convict as well, presumably innocent of any philosophy. Next slide, please. And the final aim of this paper is to see whether certain models used in the Socratic method of philosophizing may be tracked down in this exposition. Next. As we start the dialogue, the counsellee says, he did not scald him intentionally, it was totally accidental. Counselor, what do you mean when you say that the convict burnt Watkins unintentionally? Counsellee, well, there was no intention of scalding Watkins in his action of turning on the hot tap by mistake. Counselor, would you consider the sentence to be one of the same form as there was no elephant in this room? Counsellee, well, the elephant in the room are concrete things where the former can be contained in the latter, which is not so literally in the case of the intention and the action. Next, please. Counselor, but when you say there was no intention in the action of scalding, what does it mean? Does it mean an absence? Of course it does. Counselor, does the above sentence refer to an absence? Counsellee, what do you mean? Counselor, is there a reality like absence of an elephant in the room? What would this absence look like? A big bubble in the shape of an elephant where an elephant could have been? Counsellee, of course it is absurd to say so. When we say there is an absence of elephant or of X or Y or Z, I want to rule out a suggestion or the possibility. I want to contradict the previous assertion or correct a false impression. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Yes, that's right. In the same vein, when you describe the convict's action as there is an absence of intention of scalding in the convict's act of turning on the hot tap, it would precisely be to preempt the positive incline towards the intentional ascription. And I'm basically drawing your attention to a certain positive account of the action which rules out any possibility of its being intended to scald. Counsellee, yes, I agree. But why do I not say this in a positive manner? Can I go back to the previous one? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's fine. Because it is not always practicable to give all the details that would rule out the features that I want to rule out. It is not always empirically possible to give a description of every nook and corner of this room to rule out the presence of an elephant there. Next slide, please. Counsellee, so you mean when you describe the convict's action to be unintentional, you have a vast and substantial description of the action itself that would by its inherent content rule out certain other descriptions, namely that of being intentional scalding? Yeah. Counselor, yes, you see, but here is a catch there. You see, the descriptions cannot achieve that immaculate force to rule away other descriptions. Even red color does not have that consummated content to rule away the green color. It will just have a resistance to green, that's all. Counsellee, you mean there is no pre-given opposition between red and green, between intentional and unintentional? You mean the positive and the negative, the intentional versus the intentional, are two aspects of the same action? Next slide, please. Yes, absolutely right. There is nothing like an absolute freedom in doing an action, as if without any resistance. Freedom is like a dimension to measure the action. Counselor, why do you call it a dimension? Counselor, I mean a measure or a criterion. Think of a measure, say a foot rule. That is a measure of a length. Is it an absolute length? Counselor, no, it has some breadth and depth as well. Counselor, sure. And what we do when we use it to measure is to brush away the other two dimensions and focus on its length aspect only. That's exactly what we do when we judge an action to be intentional or unintentional. In the first case, we brush away the constraining factors. In the second case, we prioritize the same. Next slide, please. Counsellee, but it is the same action that is seen under the intentional or the unintentional aspect. Counselor, no, there you go wrong. To judge it under the negative aspect, to see it is in a different backdrop, in association with the other precedents. With other precedents and subsequents that infiltrate into the action and make it different from the other. When you judge it to be intentional, you would be concentrating on what he did intentionally. When you say that he did not do it intentionally, you were bringing in other disturbing factors happening in the next cubicle, making mistake in the taps, etc. When you judge it to be intentional, you would be concentrating on what you did intentionally. Tell me what you would be concentrating on. Kamsali. Let me see. Yes, he intentionally turned his attention to what the other attendant was saying. And in that process, he intentionally opened up a process of letting in a disorder in the movement of his steps. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Uh, oh, I think it's the previous slide. Can you please go back to the previous slide? Yes, let me see. He intentionally turned his attention to what the other attendant was saying, and in that process, intentionally opened in the process of letting in the disorder in the movement of his steps. Yes, next. Counselor, what else? Counselor. He intentionally kept his attention on the other things outside Watkins' cubicle that ruled out his checking out whether Watkins had really come out of the bath. Counselor, now tell me, what if the convict had really intended to scald Watkins under the precept of giving him a bath and subsequently cleaning off the cubicle? Counselor. It would be an action that would incorporate other antecedents like the prisoner's planning the murder, making preparations, being focused on the taps, contriving the pretenses, etc. Counselor. So you see, there is no bare action on which the adverbs like intentionally, unintentionally, etc. are added on from without. Yes, Counselor. But when we say, is this action intentional or unintentional, does not the word describe something more primordial than its opposed modalities? Counselor. No, the word this describes something that is already conceptualized. Give some ordinary examples of actions. Counselor. Well, walking, sewing, eating. Counselor. Well, you see that you do not put unintentional or intentional, voluntary or involuntary to these normal actions in normal circumstances. There is no neutral or briefer content of the action prior to its receiving. Prior to its receiving either of the opposite adverbs like intentionally or unintentionally, voluntary or involuntarily, knowingly or unknowingly, inadvertently or deliberately. You cannot say, is this act of scalding intentional or unintentional without betraying that you have already conceived it as intentional. Next. Yes, sorry. Kapseli. But you can, of course, ask, is this act leading to Watkins getting scalded intentional or unintentional? For in one case, it is caused by the intention of scalding, and the other case, it is the same action caused by the intention of cleaning the bath. Counselor, do not look upon actions as being caused by their intentions. Causes are antecedents to the action and hence different from the action. In that case, intentions of actions, qua putative causes, will be alienated from the action effects themselves. And this is plainly counterintuitive. Counseling. But why would you have to look at the cause as alien to the effect? Some elements of the cause surely percolate into the action effect. Counselor. In that case, different intentions, one of scalding and the other of cleaning the bath, will percolate into the action effect and render them as two distinct actions. Counseling. Now, in the light of all these findings, can you track down the error? Can I just check with the previous slide? I'll just check whether there is a continuity. Yes, that's right. Yes, Kapsele further see that what we were describing as a single action of scalding Watkins unintentionally is actually an intricate action embodying many antecedents and subsequent phases, say inattention, callousness, diversion, mistaking taps, demanding a more comprehensive moral judgment, adequately addressing all its elements. Counselor, right again. But we have again used a lot of negative adverbs here like inattention, callousness, diversion, disorder, mistake, counselor. But these are not negative adverbs. They do not trail behind a pre-given positive counterpart. I believe that negative expressions coming with un, non, in, and dis, as contrasted with not, they serve to underline an aspectual oscillation between the two facets, not pure negation, but highlighting the complementary character of these two aspects. Counselor. Right. Now, in the light of all these findings, can you track down the error made by the jurors' statements on the action? Like when they defended and described the convict's action as, he did not believe the lunatic was in, he made a mistake in the taps, etc., etc. Counsel said they were all using these negative expressions as tokens of laziness. They did not perform the labor of unpacking their positive content. Counselor, not only that, they treated all the negative adverbs as being equivalent. Counselee, I see the implication. Once all these negative descriptions were taken as equivalent, there is no further prospect of each picking out a different action. Counselor, absolutely. Once you think that there is a bare self-identical action waiting to receive the alternative adverbs like intentional, unintentional, you tend to make the further mistake that once the positive adverb is withdrawn from it, what you get is a vacuum, a non-action, and nothing to blame the agent for. Counselee. I missed this. Yeah. Yeah, counselee. But I have an upsurge of doubt again from a different direction. Suppose the convict had been planning the murder of Watkins all along, but suddenly, before he intentionally turns on the hot tap, there intrudes an electrical mechanism or a nervous disorder of his body, which actually causes that movement. In the first case of the planned action, there was a willing experience. In the second case, there isn't. Counselor, so what? Would you say that it's the same action in one case caused by the intention and in the another case caused by the external mechanism or nervous disorder? No, it comes at. Oh, let me go back. Yeah, no, it can't be. Counsel says, no, it can't be because it is an action in the true sense of the term. It cannot be caused by the intention because the intention as a causal antecedent will fall outside the action and turn the action into a brute physical movement, which is counterintuitive, which we have found. Counsel says, just right. So what happens when the external causes like the electrical mechanisms or nerve disorders intervene in the stretch of the intentional activities of the convict? Counseling. I think by the very force of its being external determinant, it breaks out into a different and discontinuous piece of reality, having a completely different quantitative identity. Counselor, that's right. In the case of the involuntary movement, one may claim to have a feeling of unreality, of being distant from the action, as contrasted with the felt involvement, which is normal in the case of a voluntary one. Counseling. But what about this putative absence of feeling? It can't be a vacuum. I think that often such cases of seemingly bare actions in the case of the so-called, in the case of the involuntary movements, they're simply symptoms of acute fatigue or an onset of mental illusions. Such fatigued actions can be, they will be stilted, discontinuous, coming in staccato jolts, so markedly different from the voluntary actions. One cannot go on insisting that there is a bare movement shared between the voluntary and the involuntary action. Counseling. So here the counselee is summing up the conclusions drawn from the discussion. Counselee, there are the following misconceptions of mine, which I hope to have got rectified. A, actions are not caused by their intentions, rather intentions and actions form a single continuity. B, the adverbs intentionally and unintentionally pick out different actions. There is no common event lying bare and ready to receive the positive modifier in one case and negative modifier on the other. And thirdly, there is no absolute positive essence of a volition or intention. Yeah. Here the counsel is also evaluating the legal come moral verdict of the jury. The counsel says none of the above insights had been appreciated by the members of the jury, nor the convict himself. All this resulted into a gross criminal negligence of the positive content of the convict's actions, leading to the flawed judgment of the convict being not guilty. Yeah, so I finished the dialogue, and here I made some concluding observations with a passing reference to Boghossian's paper. The paper is titled Socratic Pedagogy, Perplexity, Humility, Shame, and a Broken Egg. Identifies 5 steps in the Socratic method of teaching or philosophizing: wonder, hypothesis, refutation and cross-examination, acceptance and rejection of the hypothesis, and lastly, action. So let us see, hopefully, whether these methods can be tracked down in the dialogical exposition we have just kind of followed. Yeah. Here in this case, see the need for philosophical counseling does not arise with any any sublime wonder at life or reality as a whole, but with a particular confusion as how not doing something can lead to such a scandalous occurrence as death, or the puzzle that why the jury could not see any wrong performed by the convict, or as in the counterfactual situation we conceived, how a non-action is judged as guilty. The hypotheses that were formed and the opposed hypotheses were the counselor has addressed the two opposed hypotheses, one, an action being caused by an intention and in that manner falling out of the latter. And the opposed one is intention itself having an activated character that gradually thickens out into a more definitive and fleshy content. One of these hypotheses was argued to be acceptable, by the other was rejected. Yeah, sorry, the previous slide. Yeah, refutation and cross-examination. The counselor had repeatedly cross-examined the counseling in the shape of what we call rapid-fire session. The following issues, the counselor teased out the positive content of absence by subjecting him to stepwise interrogation. He was made to realize the absurdity of being confronted with a bare and brute movement coming in the form of a human action. And lastly, he was finally goaded to articulate the actual distinction between voluntary and involuntary actions. About the action taken, see, this philosophical clarification of the notion of action itself shows that our intentions are silent actions nested in the white backdrop of our forms of living, which may or may not take the structure of fleshy limb movements. This new turn of our thought is itself an action. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, ma'am. We will be taking questions at the end of the conference, at the end of the session. Bala sir, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I think Professor Rakesh Chandra has joined, who has to chair this session. Welcome, sir. Welcome. Good afternoon, Professor Rakesh Chandra.
Sir, I can't see his name in the in the participant list.
So it's with the name Dean Academy.
Okay. Yes, sir. Sir, may we request you to switch your video on and please take over the session.
Professor Rakesh Chandra, are you able to unmute your mic and open your camera?
I'll reach to him personally if he's facing any technical issues. But sir, we have made you the co-host. You have the permission to unmute yourself. I think, sir, there's some technical glitch. So, Vikas, sir, we may proceed. I'll reach to that also personally.
Yeah, Madhurika, you try to reach out to Professor Rakesh Chandra so that the problem gets resolved. Okay. And in between, I think we'll proceed. Vikas, proceed, please.
Sure, sir. While Rakesh sir joins, let me introduce you our next speaker. Avaneesh is the founder of Lee Monastic, a beautiful green space where he focuses on the inner potentials of individuals through amalgamating philosophy, psychology, art, and nature. With a background in medicine, Avaneesh went on to complete his master's degree in philosophy from Kerala University and another master's degree in clinical psychology. He is also a certified practitioner of American Philosophical Practitioners Association, APPA. Currently, he is also a consultant with the National Institute of Speech and Hearing on the project named Innovation by Youth Abilities, Government of Kerala. A consultant for various organizations and programs, Avaneesh has also been collaborating creatively with brands and broadcasters like Walt Disney, Cartoon Network, Discovery Channel, YouTube, among others. An ardent practitioner of philosophy, Avaneesh is currently doing research to develop a philosophical archetype for inner transformation with the University of Kerala. A believer in the immeasurable possibilities of the individual, Avaneesh intends to make individuals realize their true potential through meaningful and profound interactions. So with the permission of the chair, I would like to now invite Avaneesh for his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Vikas, and hello, everyone. In the beginning, let me congratulate my dear Dr. Bala and his entire team for organizing such a wonderful event at such a crisis-ridden time. Actually, I'm sitting in my farmhouse, so an occasional noise from the rooster, please kindly forgive me for that. I've asked my guy to take those birds as far away as possible, but they are like us philosophers. They have a wild mind of their own. So let me begin. I've titled my session as on why philosophers cannot be counselors. Philosophical counseling as a practical discipline, as a profession, or as an engagement which can make a difference in society is at a very nascent stage, at least in India. And being a rising discipline and juxtaposed against psychological counseling, which has flourished, philosophical counseling is naturally bound to go through many comparisons, criticisms, and resistance, not just from among the experts, but also among the general public, who have to trust the practitioners with their life and their mental well-being. Hence, errors from the practitioner's side at these early stages will be amplified and exaggerated in the ICT onlookers, and also will dampen the credibility of the discipline itself. And that is why we should constantly be aware of the grave responsibility that we are taking upon our shoulders as the pioneers in the practice of this discipline, at least in the Indian setting. And in this session, I will be focusing on those tendencies and attributes which philosophers and or philosophy possess that should be avoided or overcome in order to do philosophical counseling effectively. Over the last 2 days or 2.5 days, I'm sure you've been listening to some amazing talks on various possibilities and scopes and what to do of philosophical counseling. So I'm going to take a more focused approach and talk about what not to do as philosophers in philosophical counseling. On that pretext, let me begin with a hard statement that a philosopher cannot be a counselor. A philosopher should not be a counselor. A philosopher should not do counseling. Why? Just like a medical doctor should not be or should not do engineering, or a painter should not do excavation, what I mean to say is being a philosopher is not the qualification for doing counseling. Being a philosopher qualifies one to do philosophizing. To do counseling, you have to be a counselor. So I reiterate, being a philosopher does not make you a counselor. Simply, you need to be a counselor to be a counselor. So the philosopher has to explore and accommodate and integrate the counseling side or the counselor side as well in order to become an effective philosophical counselor. In the term philosophical counseling, the term counseling, the word counseling is of primary importance. Why? If we give importance to the word philosophical as primary, then the process would become, or a chance to become, philosophizing. And philosophical counseling is fundamentally counseling. It's not a standalone independent process. It is basically a form of counseling. Hence, a philosophical counselor must know counseling and of course also philosophy in order to truly practice philosophical counseling. And philosophers need to know counseling not as a crash course, but a thorough understanding of the discipline and the methods as a course. Crash courses, of course, can give you an awareness about the amount of stuff you need to learn in detail, but the crash course is not your entry ticket to practice philosophical counseling. And I would like to quote the famous philosopher Ran Lahav from his essay or the book Essays on Philosophical Counseling. He says that an approach to counseling should be viewed not as being either purely psychological or purely philosophical, but as containing more or fewer philosophical and psychological elements. So the philosopher has to understand that the process is a process of counseling as well. At this stage, to exemplify my points further, I would like to introduce a case, one of those cases which has come to me. So Mr. K is a man in his 30s who has come to me, or who had come to me, with the problem that he feels inadequate in front of his wife, excuse me, both professionally and sexually. This is the issue we will be exemplifying throughout the session. If we talk about it, philosophy is a search for truth, and a philosopher is a seeker of truth. And this search has neither a time limit nor a specific target. But counseling has a time limit and a specific targeted outcome. The philosopher has a wondrous explorer's attitude, exploring on and on until she or he finds a gem or not. That's completely different from the counselor's attitude. A counselor, to be honest, is an unwanted part of anybody's life. Nobody wants to go to a counselor. Nobody wants a counselor in their life. They try every other way possible to solve their problem. And when there is no other option, they reach out to a counselor. Hence, a counselor's responsibility is to make herself or himself unwanted again at the earliest. Hence, a counselor should have a time-limited and target-oriented attitude. I'm going to quote Ran again. Ran currently focuses on deep philosophy. It is a deep philosophical contemplation for unraveling insights from within. So during my intimate interactions with Ran, I've understood that Ran is quite vocal in his disapproval of philosophical counseling. For him, a counseling session or a conversation is not enough to go into deep philosophical insights. But I personally don't want to go to that extreme. However, pure philosophizing is definitely not an effective way. We need more efficient, effective, and adapted methods, but firmly rooted in philosophical thoughts. So a philosopher has to adapt that time-limited and target-oriented attitude during the process of philosophical counseling. To take the example of Mr. K, Mr. K's problem is causing him a lot of distress, both in his personal and professional life. And hence, he's looking for a specific solution to his problem, that too at the earliest. A never-ending explorative process is not going to work in this case. Philosophizing is a journey on which the philosopher embarks on alone. It is a personal journey, the course of which is determined by the philosopher. The philosopher has a very self-centered attitude in terms of the problem. But counseling is a journey of relationship, which the counselor embarks on along with the counselee. It is a professional yet intimate journey, the course of which is mutually determined. The counselor has a very counselee-centered attitude in terms of the problem. So the philosopher also has to be very aware during the journey of the philosophical counseling, to be aware that it is a journey revolving around the problem of the counselee. In this case, Mr. K and the counselor, in this case me, Mr. K and I will have to embark on the process together, and the journey is totally centered around the problem of Mr. K. If we think of belief systems, the belief system of the philosopher is what leads him in his path of inquiry. He needs to have a conviction and a mental or intellectual alignment to that certain system in order to make headway in the path. And this alignment can either be in favor or against the system. In either case, the philosopher is led by his belief system. In counseling, the counselor's belief systems and values are of no importance, as the central focus is on the counselee's belief system, even if the counselor is mentally, morally, and intellectually against it. Of course, the counselor can evaluate if the belief system causes distress to the counselee, but the point is that the counselor's belief system has no role in counseling. To quote the philosophical practitioner Dries Bolle from his candid essay, It says an additional difficulty consists in not being able to distinguish between one's own concerns and those of the counselees. The awareness of one's own philosophical biases would seem to be an indispensable step in becoming a philosophical counselor. So a philosopher must be acutely aware of one's own philosophical and belief systems and stay away from them corrupting the process. In this case, it doesn't matter if the counselor feels it important for a man to be sexually adequate, but the counselee, Mr. K, feels so. Hence, the counselor has to keep aside his beliefs and values so that he can focus on Mr. K's problem without prejudice. Let me also add that referral is an important part of any healing profession. If the philosophical counselor realizes that the specific problem is out of the scope of his work or does not match with his skill set, or can be dealt with by a different specialist in a more effective way, then one should immediately refer the counselee to someone where she or he has a better chance of healing. To do this judiciously, the philosophical counselor should have an awareness about counseling, psychological counseling, and also other disciplines involved in this milieu. It is very important because, in a way, referral is also a form of counseling. The problems in philosophy and the problems in counseling are quite different, not in terms of their themes, but in terms of their context. The problems in philosophy are not individualistic. Though there are themes like subjectivity, or freedom, joy, love, etc., they are not touching upon the person or human as a specific, unique individual. While the problems in counseling are personal, emotional, crisis-ridden, which demands a solution, which demands a calming of the person. We cannot say that we can take only those people with philosophical problems, because in a counseling context, we cannot segregate problems as purely philosophical. All philosophical problems in a counseling setting are personal, emotional, crisis-ridden, because the individual is suffering and wants a solution. In her essay, Dr. Tillman says, the message of the new philosophical counseling movement is that life has significant philosophical aspects which cannot be reduced to psychological mechanisms and processes. Anxious deliberation concerning whether or not to leave one's spouse, for example, does not have to be taken as evidence of a psychological disorder, that is, a state of affairs requiring psychological counseling. Now, having said that, one cannot take the other extreme, that every problem which is not psychological is philosophical. Because since it is endured by the living, breathing, experiencing individual, every problem is emotional. So the philosopher has to get out of classifying a problem as philosophical or psychological or something else. Instead, the focus should be on understanding the problem as experienced by the counselee and assess if it can be resolved through philosophical counseling methods. One criticism about philosophers is that they often tend to intellectualize problems. Even when dealing with problems of emotionality, the tendency is to intellectualize, rationalize, or rather avoid the emotional subjective aspects. Whereas in counseling, the counselee's problems are understood from his or her emotional, perspectival, affective aspects. Intellectualization is rare, or if at all, is either secondary or tertiary. Because how much ever advanced or intellectual the problem is, it is a problem which causes distress to the client. The emotional aspect is predominant in all counseling problems. So the philosopher has to be aware of this and withhold his tendency to immediately intellectualize it to the client. In our case of Mr. K, we can philosophically say that Mr. K's problem is that of a fallacious understanding of the self and of the relationship with the other. But there is a deep-rooted emotional element to it. Mr. K is suffering. He's clearly sad, dull, and finding it hard to live with dignity. So one need not categorize it as a purely philosophical problem, but assess if there is a possible solution for this problem in philosophical schools of thought. Another criticism is that philosophers tend to use philosophical jargon. They mention philosophers, theories, and all sorts of technical words. Often, the counselees end up more confused, deterred, and disliking the process. Nobody wants to attend a class. And the counselee is not coming to get a degree in philosophy. Counseling has to be simple, using the clearest, most straightforward language. Failed communication in itself is a cause of most of the problems in people's lives. And we don't want the counselor to add on to the same problem. And to come to a counselor is not an easy decision. Nobody wants to share their deepest, most private, or the dirtiest secrets with a stranger. They come to a counselor because they've tried everything else. In that frustration and emotionality, they are not looking for an intellectualization or a complex philosophical deliberation. They just want to solve their problem. The philosophical practitioner Ad Hugenjik describes the point at which one may seek philosophical counseling when the person's dialogue with the world no longer flows naturally, but is difficult, complicated, or painful. At those times, one is almost forced to philosophize about oneself, that is, self-reflect, or about the world, in order to re-examine one's way of life. I agree with Hugenjik here. One can engage in philosophizing, but without using any of those methodological and intellectual puritanism. It has to happen in the most simplistic, spontaneous, organic way possible, not in the form of a lecture on philosophizing. So the philosopher has to be very wary and aware to make the philosophizing process as accessible to the counselee as possible. It's noteworthy that the philosopher's engagement is one of objectivity. She approaches the problem with, or aspires to approach the problem with as much stark objectivity as possible without any subjective corruptions. But a counselor, while aspiring to look at the problem objectively, what becomes the core of the approach is empathy. Trying to look at the problem as the counselee is looking at it or experiencing it is pivotal to the entire counseling process. While objectivity is at the core of philosophizing, empathy is at the core of counseling. So the philosopher has a double advantage here because he's already used to being objective. Now he should be aware of the importance of empathy factor. It is famously said that the greatest innovations happen when there is a grave problem that needs to be solved. So it's important that a counselor feels the problem Mr. K is facing, standing in the latter's shoes. Instead of sympathizing with Mr. K, which will only corroborate within him the feeling of self-deprecation even further, the counselor should instill trust in Mr. K by showing empathy, by showing, yes, I understand how you feel. Thus, empathy should form the crux of a philosopher's process of philosophical counseling. Philosophers are often speakers. They tend to talk about their thoughts, and they are more used to people listening to them rather than the other way around, most of the time. While a counselor is majorly a listener, he is an active listener, intensely listening to what the counselee is talking and posing the right question at pivotal junctures. So the philosopher has to be aware of the listening self within him. Mr. K, like any other individual who comes for counseling, has a lot to vent out. He needs to go through a cathartic process. For the counselor, the importance of letting Mr. K talk uninterrupted is that this will give a lot of scope to find out errors and dissonance in his thoughts, actions, and beliefs. Thus, active listening is very, very important. Now, I'm going to talk about something I've often heard some philosophical academicians talk about. They say that they can do counseling because they give advice to their students all the time. And also that many people come to them for advice. But advice giving is the last thing one ought to do in the counseling process. Counseling is the process in which the counselee is empowered to self-reflect and come up with his or her own solutions or resolutions. The counselor's role is to ask the right questions, place a metaphorical mirror in front of the counselee, make the counselee think and to relook at his or her own thoughts, values, beliefs. In essence, to relook at one's own philosophy of the self and the world. So the philosophical counselor is to be very aware of refraining from giving directions. In the case of Mr. K, he tried to share his issues with a few of his close friends and also with some professionals. But according to him, all he got was directions, advice, what to do, what not to do, while the core of the problem was not addressed. What Mr. K truly needed was for him to self-reflect and understand where he has gone wrong and how he could improve. The counselor can provide tips, backgrounds, and thought-provoking questions, but the insight has to come up from within Mr. K. And I move on to my last point. I've often seen that there is a tendency to criticize other disciplines to show philosophical counseling in brighter light by contrast. For example, psychology calls its counselees as patients. Another frequent criticism is that methods like REBT or existential therapy, etc., which psychology uses, can be better used by philosophers, since philosophers know the basic subject matter better. But I would tend to say that these are not healthy tendencies. We should thrive by our own merit. So the philosopher or the philosophical community aspiring to be philosophical counselors, we have to focus on finding from our vast repository of philosophical wealth the most effective and unique methods that would bring changes in people's lives. In the case of K, what we understand so far is that he is genuinely concerned about how other people evaluate him, especially his wife in this situation. Hence, it's very clear that others' words affect him, but his beliefs are purely based on his own thoughts and conclusions. It is here that I introduced the Jain concept of Syadavada and Anekandavada, the many-sidedness, the multiple perspectival nature of the truth. Instead of the 5 blind men touching the elephant example, I gave him the example of the movie Rashomon, in which the same incident is narrated differently by different persons or different characters from different perspectives. I used this method because Mr. K is a big-time movie buff. Once he got introduced to the idea of the many-sidedness of truth, I had asked him to talk to his wife and get her feedback on the issue he's worried about, because so far he thrives solely on his own assumptions. But Mr. K was very apprehensive and hesitant to encounter her in a conversation. So I asked him to come up with his own method to engage with her. So he thought and suggested a questionnaire which both he and his wife would answer. And through that process, he got his answers. I'm not going into the details of the answers. Hence, the method I choose is an ancient Jain method, but I tweak it to suit the context. And today, most of the methods we use in philosophical counseling are Western. And they need not necessarily sit with the socio-cultural DNA of the Indian population. And all Indian schools of thoughts are at least 1,000 years old, and most of them have a strong religious connection, at least in the eyes of the layperson. Hence, as practitioners, we must improvise the Indian methods to better suit the contemporary sensibilities and also extract the method from the religion to make it more acceptable for people of all belief systems. And also think about coming up with a methodological framework. Of course, one methodology is impossible with such a variety, which is our strength as philosophers. But a rough framework is very important for us to be taken seriously. So I would say, as a young professional discipline, we philosophers should look at philosophical counseling as a unique and efficient method under the larger umbrella of counseling and explore and come up with methods from the 3 millennia old philosophical tradition in order to bring about meaningful changes in the day-to-day life of individuals. In reaction to the brand of philosophy, which Lou Marinoff puts it, the brand of philosophy has had much to do with itself and little to do with the external world. So I would say the philosophical counseling movement has to bring philosophy back into connection with everyday life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avaneesh. I would now like to request Professor Rakesh to switch on his video and be with us. Professor Rakesh. Yes, sir. Hello, sir. So let me just introduce Professor Rakesh briefly before he takes over as the chair of the session. He is the head of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Lucknow, and he's also a cultural director and dean of academics at the University of Lucknow. Sir, over to you. Sir, you need to unmute yourself.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I have just enjoyed the lecture before this and also the inaugural session. It's with great trepidation that I joined this whole discussion on philosophical counseling, because as you all know that some of us have been trained to believe in a rather conservative understanding of philosophy, wherein we do believe that both the so-called traditions of philosophy, which have their background in Greece and in India, believe that philosophy is largely concerned with what Wilfrid Sellars says, talking about matters most general, how they hang together. So it is an abstraction in universality, in generality, that the nature of philosophical enterprise consists in. While when we talk about individual crises of particularity, there is an attempt which needs to be done, wherein you relate the individual and the particular to the general, which takes much doing. In one way, as I remember Godavari saying that all counseling is philosophical, I find it rather strange, because that's a bad case of over-definition. And particularly as an Indian philosopher, people should know that Ativyapti is as problematic as any other. So when you talk philosophy as a love for knowledge, you generally do get a working definition, but then it does not help you to separate it from anything else. Similarly, when you talk about counseling, you think about counseling of all sorts. You go to a medical practitioner for counseling, you go to a psychologist for the counseling, so on and so forth. And therefore, when you talk about the scope of a definition, my difficulty always has been that how do you understand philosophical counseling? So is philosophical counseling trying to help people, like Wittgenstein would say, helping the fly to get out of the fly bottle? So is it meant only for philosophers who are facing philosophical perplexity? Or is it meant for people who are faced with any general matter and helping them to relate it to a more general matter, and then to see that how that general matter is related to the axiological general framework? It is only in the third sense that I think that we are, as more conservative practitioners of academic philosophy, can work in. And as just the preceding paper that we saw, which was an exciting paper, that why philosophers cannot be counselors, I think it's very, very important to see that, yes, philosophers cannot be counselors in a very, very important way. Because in many cases, in many, many ways, we are told that actually giving directions for specifics is not the task of philosophy at all. Although, as has been explained to us by the Master Kant, when you take the general rule, you collect information, you use taste, tact, intuition, and then you apply it to a specific case. What you have in case of epistemology as schematism, you need to have something similar to that in case of your ethics too. So how does the general principle apply to a particular case? You need something like schematism. And we all, as teachers of philosophy, know that there are people who have objected to the idea of schematism, even in epistemology. So there are people who worry that there are people, including very great people from Oxford, who said that, schematism could easily be dispensed with in case of Kant's critique of pure reason, while many others, including Strawson and our very eminent teacher, Professor Pranav Sen, he thought that actually schematism was perhaps the most crucial part of epistemic applications to specifics. So I really think that when we talk about philosophical counseling, we need to tread very, very safely. And we need to see that how, to my mind, the view that I take to be most potent and useful for us is a view wherein philosophical counseling actually takes the form where we help an individual in perplexity to take her issues to a larger, more general frame level, and then to see the philosophical implications and their interrelationships. That is what we are competent in. For the rest of the things, we are, as individuals, fairly capable of doing just about anything. And this is something which I want to say and share very loud and clear, because this is exactly what is also happening in the other most influential field of philosophy these days, and which is actually consciousness studies. A large part of consciousness studies right now is taking on questions of empirical science head on. And I think philosophers are absolutely, absolutely incompetent to do that. And yet philosophers are pretending that they can understand mind polygraphs and the others. I think a certain amount of not modesty, but honesty is something which we require in philosophers. And that's why I really like the paper just preceding this one, read by that young, beautiful person who spoke about that what philosophers should be cautious about, that they do not overstep what they're doing qua philosophers, not as individuals. Of course, as individuals, you might then take up a full course in psychology, a full course in medicine. And we know that a lot of people in the ancient world and in the medieval world were full-time scientists and went to philosophizing. So I think that that's what I just wanted to share before we got to listen to the exciting papers of this session.
Would you invite Professor R.P. Singh?
Yeah, so I now invite Professor R.P. Singh to present his paper.
Just to introduce Professor R.P. Singh, he is a professor at the Center of Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has been twice chairperson Center for Philosophy, thrice member of Academic Council and the University Court. Besides being a member of and chairperson of various committees at the university, he has also been twice member of governing body of ICPR. Besides being member of Board of Studies of many universities. Sir, I will invite you.
Thank you, Dr. Vikas, Professor Bal Garpati, and thank you, Professor Rakesh Chandra, for being here and also illuminating us something about what a philosophical counseling is. So, in fact, we all know that there is not one philosopher; there are many philosophers, and J.O. Wisdom has already indicated about it. That if you go to any continent or any country or any department or meet the individuals, you'll find that there is no one philosopher. There are many philosophers, many perspectives are there. And in one such perspective is that everything is not philosophy, but everything can be philosophized. So if there are certain contested issues in the field of practicing psychologists or psychiatrists, they definitely take the help from the philosophers to sort out the problems, or if there is any discrepancy in the concept itself, then you need the job of a philosopher. You know, if there is a water, it is H2O, of course there is no philosophy in it. But if I say that this is holy water, then philosophical issues emerge. So everything can be philosophized. This is one issue is there. So let's not be so conservative or traditional or orthodox about it. Let's be a little open-minded. Second thing is that philosophy is a very foundational subject, and like history or mathematics, For every subject, you need to have a study historically, or if you go to the sciences, mathematics is important. So as a foundational subject, it has a, a kind of, attitude and temperament to interfere into other affairs also, and not get completely shaped, but some kind of dialectical exchange is there. So my conviction is that counseling, of course, I do not say that every philosophical act is a counseling, but definitely there are elements of counseling in philosophy. Philosophers themselves get treated by that kind of an attitude. So that's my general kind of a thing. Besides thanking Professor Bala Garpati and the team they have, and for the last more than 2.5 days, they the various teams have been developing with their cooperation, various speakers who are there. So what I have taken up is that how stories, fables, and tales they help us to develop some kind of philosophical counseling, in the sense that because the values which are enshrined into it, they can help us with very specific reference to the Pañcatantra and its roots that can be found in Kautilya's Arthashastra. So, but before I do that, I'll make a little reflection on what do I understand by counseling, because and that also philosophical counseling. So if I come to the slide number 2, that counseling falls under umbrella term of talking therapy and allows people to discuss their problems and difficulties, the kind of unsorted out issues, certain layers of confusion which are there with the people in their articulation, and with the help of talking to the person, having a dialogue with the person, those unexplored layers can be opened up, and that will help and facilitate the solution of the problem. So it could be interrogating, it could be arguing, inquiring into the hidden layers of self-deceptions. So we generally know that others deceive us, but we are deceived by our own ideas. That is something which is very important one, and which comes up very substantially here. So now philosophical counselors use dialogue and dialectical method with the illustrations of fables, tales, and other such narratives which are loaded with values and virtues to explore the inner conviction, commitments, delusions, etc. The purpose of philosophical counseling is not only to get acquainted with the, there is a cross talk going on. So can you please help that thing? That there's some cross talk going on. So also I wanted to record it, but I don't know how to do it. So it's gone. Anyway, so delusions. The purpose of philosophical counseling is not only to get acquainted with the beliefs and the attitudes of the persons, their actions, their ambitions, their values, their purposes, their emotions, their frustrations, etc., but also to evaluate the transformation, development, and evolution in the counselee, the client. So with the interaction, if there is some change, some transformation, some evolution, that can be also done. The categories of philosophy and the talking therapy of counselors are instantiable and concretizable. That means it can be exemplified and it can be elaborated in the course of time. I've taken up 2 models. Next slide, Vikas. So the who and the what of counseling. So the who could be the character, the ethos, an entity. It could be real, it could be imaginary, it could be metaphoric, but it is suggestive to a great extent, and it could be even paradoxical also. So, but it has that kind of a role. The what could be the mythos, the apprehensions, the anxieties, the worries, etc. In interpersonal relationships within the species, or it could be interspecies also. There are many interspecies problems which have come up with the human world. The who is the being and the what is the becoming aspect of it. I take the who as the agent, and then rest of the things become the becoming. The who could be the kind. There are many such things which are very kind and has to interact with not the kind of things. Yeah. So, and has to interact with the kind as well as the not the kind. I'll elaborate this issue. And the what could be the economic, political, and administrative problems. The who could be put in the hierarchical order. The subject, the character, the ethos, that is manifested generally in a very hierarchical order. Now, philosophical counseling pertains to actions consisting of, involving, or resulting from earlier actions. It suggests the ability to adopt means to an end or to turn what is at hand into a cognitive skill. You can go to the next slide, Vikas. Okay. A skill, the action or the process of performing or doing something. The ambition and challenge for philosophical counseling, as it is, should show the way to study all the subjects. Philosophical counseling, because it gives very general formulation kind of a thing. Philosophical counseling has to innovate a method of participation between knowledge and action, wisdom and behavior, value and fact, theory and practice, and all such traditional and modern dichotomies. If we are able to show the participation, say, between abstract and concrete, metaphor and reality, etc., and this has been done, when Bhasyakaras even write the Bhasyas, they are just trying to make sense of it, how it works. We shall be in a position to appreciate the issues concerning some of the apparently insoluble epistemological, ontological, moral, and aesthetic problems. Now, these are just simply kind of an outline of it. And I have taken a Pañcatantra, the 5 treatises, and I wanted to explore some of the stories very comprehensively, which I have done some elsewhere. But here I will just simply place it, presuming that people generally know about those stories, or at least they have some acquaintance with those stories. So one of the facts is that, like in Indian tradition of culture and philosophy, we have very many such stories are there. So in ancient Indian collection of interrelated animal fables are that are as old as we are able to ignore, imagine. So the dates are not very much clear to us, and the text author has been attributed to Vishnu Sharma, who was in some recensions, and Vasu Bhag in others, both of which may be the pen names. He is stated to be teaching the principles of good government to 3 princes of Amar Shakti. So the king Amar Shakti, he had invited this man. He was at the age of 80 when he was invited, and to teach his relatively less intelligent 3 children. So Pañcatantra is a series of interwoven fables, many of which deploy metaphors of anthropomorphized animals. So with human values, virtues, and vices, its narrative illustrates, for the benefit of the 3 ignorant princes, the central Hindu principles of Niti. So while in Niti, that means the wise conduct of life. So these are the 5 treatises, which are Mitra Bhed, Mitra Samprapti, and etc., which can be easily availed. There's so many videos which I've made up, and some of the narratives which are there, I've given it. I'll come straight to the my point of the values and the virtues which are there. So please go ahead to another slide. So what are the values and the virtues which are enshrined in these stories, and how can they be used to the human world, and to what extent? And by using those things, what kind of intricate problems which are fixed somewhere in our mind can be helped to be removed, and thus some kind of a development or enlightenment or emancipation can take place. So the narratives, when we read the stories, the narrative is value loaded, like in the Mitra Bhed. So if loving kindness be not shown to friends and souls in pain, to teachers, servants, and oneself, what use in life? What gain? Politics of friendship, or friendship for pleasure, or friendship for utility, but friendship for virtues is something which is very important one. So Aristotle has laid down these three kinds of friendships: friendship of pleasure, of virtues, of utility, and of virtues. The virtues becomes the highest one. And we find that the friendship of virtues is something which is enshrined in these stories. So the first treatise features a jackal named Damanaka as unemployed minister in a kingdom ruled by a lion. He, along with his moralizing sidekick named Karatak, conspired to break up alliances and friendships of the Lion King. A series of fables, roughly 30 to 40, describe the conspiracies and causes that lead to close and inseparable friends breaking up. So the story is very longish one, and the narrative goes like this. Now, the narrative has certain style of doing it, and certain metaphors have been used into it. So the ambition and challenge of Pañcatantra is to educate the three princes who are relatively less intelligent. The teacher Vishnu Sharma chose the animal characters because most of the time those children were playing in the forest with the animals, and so the metaphor has to come from those animals and the forest and the situations like that. But the aim should be to show how to live in the society. That was the aim. So these animals characters, but these animals are metaphoric, symbolic, suggestive, and sometimes paradoxical with double meanings. But they show the creativity of the author. Author's creative potentiality is manifest that way. So as a Niti Shastra, or treatise of wise conduct of life, it is considered a treatise on political science and knowledge of wise behavior, Niti Vidyam. This is done through the telling of moral stories in which birds, beasts, and humans interact. Interest is maintained throughout through the device of enclosed narratives in which a story is interrupted by an illustrative tale before resuming. The style is elaborate, and there are frequent pithy verse interludes to illustrate the points made by the various speakers. Now the metaphors which have been used are also very interesting ones. The names connote the character observable in nature, but also map a human personality that a reader can readily identify. For example, the deer characters are presented as a metaphor for the charming, innocent, peaceful, and tranquil personality who is a target for those who seek a prey to exploit, while the crocodile is presented to symbolize dangerous intent hidden beneath a welcoming ambience, waters in the lotus flower laden pond. This is the symbolic representation of social life as well. Dozens of different types of wildlife found in India are thus named, and they constitute an array of symbolic characters in the Pañcatantra. Thus, the names of the animals evoke layered meaning that resonates with the reader, and the same story can be read at different levels, but the aim is to educate the three princes. So this is how he wanted to unfold the layers of social life also. Now, in this narrative, I find that what was the strategy behind that teacher? What exactly he wanted to tell the children? It's not that he wanted to tell the children the animal behavior, and to live with that behavior. That's not the game. That's not the goal of the author. The author has a particular intent which he wants to bring it to the student, to the three princes there. So he begins with a story, but then the story gets anthropomorphized, and then finally it comes to the human world. And once it comes to the human world, then it is believed that some enlightenment has now come up to the children. So on account of these, which provide by far the greater part of the text, the work has been described as an anthology of sometimes contradictory verses from widespread sources relating to statecraft. Its literary sources are the expert tradition of political and economic science of Kautilya's Arthashastra. Now, this is what I will try to unfold. And the folk and the literary traditions of storytelling. So it was there in the tradition in India, right from the beginning itself, that storytelling is some kind of, folk tradition. And then it came in the Shastriya Parampara also in a very substantive manner. And there are very many stories which are there. And it's there even in the Greek tradition also. Various fables, tales are there. In the Bible also, there are some, fables and tales which are there. So this is the way they wanted to, start the story. So it draws from the Dharma and the Arthashastras, quoting them extensively. So it is also explained that Niti represents an admirable attempt to answer the insistent question how to win the utmost possible joy from life in the world of men. So because joy is something which people are aspiring by nature, but it is now getting suppressed because of certain misconceptions which people have. And with the story and then by certain illustrations, so that layer of deception is getting unfolded. This is what I want to place before. And that Niti is the harmonious development of the powers of man, a life in which security, prosperity, resolute action, friendship, and good learning are so combined to produce, some kind of a stable joy kind of a thing in the society and peace things. Now, if we look at the characters and the plot and everything else which is there in the Pañcatantra, so it very symbolically reflects what is there in the Arthashastra. For instance, knowledge of basic instincts of humans like hunger, sleep, fear, anger, sex, these 5 basic instincts. And then you have the corresponding features like acquaintance and apprehensions coming together, happiness and frustrations, fear and anxiety, guilt, loneliness, etc. On the one hand, all these things emerge. And on the other hand, we find there is a knowledge or consciousness of planning, of administration, of economic and political activities, etc. They also emerge to solve those problems with values and virtues guiding them. So general model of articulation lies only in this. We begin with the basic instincts, and then we go to the corresponding expressions of those instincts, and then look at the knowledge which can regulate and help us to solve the negative aspects of it. And therefore, the positivity should emerge, happiness should emerge, and values should prevail over everything. This is complex, but this is the way that the plots are organized, basically. Now, in the stories, we find that there are animals who are protecting their territories and trying to extend it. But the territory is something very important for all the animals. They identify their territory. They want to live and die for that. Territory is important for the human beings also. They, Desh, Nadu, and Watan, kind of a thing is very important for everybody. So territory is something which Chandragupta Chanakya also emphasized a lot on it. Then you have the friendship, And also you have the enmity. So if the friendship is there, enemies are also there. Sometimes even the friends become the enemies and enemies become the friend. So there is a dialectical interface between them. These are not fixed categories. They are very flexible and depends on what kind of situations we are using it. It's there in the animal world. It's there in the human world as well. Then there is alliance.
Professor,
Animals also there.
Can you
Animals.
Can you wind up so that we can have question and answer session?
Yeah. Well, just very quick actually. So I thought I still have 3-4 minutes time. So friendship and enmity, alliance, diplomacy, military, and everything comes. Conspiracy is very important aspect of it. It is also there. Informers are important. Breaking up friendship and new friends emerging. These things are also substantially there. Now Kautilya's Arthashastra. So I think I have 3 slides and it will take only 4 minutes. So the Arthashastra has a twofold aim. It seeks to show how the ruler should protect his territory, how territory should be acquired. The end of primary goal is Yogakshema. That means protection, security, and stability of the state. The king had to be acquainted with all the kinds of knowledge on Vikshiki and Trayi and Varta and Dandaniti, the element of justice which is there. The important thing which I would like to place is the role of power dynamics in that thing, and it is also equally metaphorically suggested in the fables there, that Arthashastra is founded is a profound articulation of power which has been metaphorically introduced and developed in the Pañcatantra. Kautilya defines and prioritizes power and insists that all 3 must exist, but ideally they need to be in the following priority. That is Mantri Shakti, that means power of the counselor and the diplomacy, counsel and their diplomacy. Counsels are here again important one. They are basically pandits. They are knowledgeable people. They knew philosophy and they used to give the counseling to the king. And not only the sick person requires counseling, even the enlightened persons require counseling. I think the psychiatrists have to think about it. So then the second one is about Prabhava Shakti, that means military power and the economic power. And the third one is Utsaha Shakti, the power of the personal energy. This is what may be now given in the leadership and management manual. Besides the above, Kautilya divides perception into 3 categories. Directly, that is about the Anvikshiki kind of a thing. And if the questions are there, I can just reply to them. And I will not take up justice, but the highest thing, the highest value which was introduced in the Pañcatantra and also later on in the Hitopadesh and other such texts which are there is that peace. Peace has to prevail over everything. War is not the last resort. War has to be modified. So may peace forever yield happiness to all the victorious possessors of the earth. May just men forever be free from adversity and the fame of those who do good long flourish. May prudence like a glorious sun shine continuously. So there is a prayer which is given there, and this prayer is something which is meant to create a kind of peace as the ultimate goal for the thing. It's there in the state, it's there in the stories, and it's value loaded in that sense of the term. So thank you very much, Professor Bala and Professor Rakesh Chandraji, for the patience. I stop here now. Thank you. You have to unmute Rakesh Chandra. Unmute Rakesh.
Thank you very much for this very beautiful presentation. As is usual with Professor RPC, he's able to connect many things together. He's also, besides being a scholar of ancient texts, he's absolutely up to date with things. And I once again take this opportunity to take you down to ask some fundamental questions here again. As philosophers, we know that philosophical counseling is extremely exciting, and the issues, as Professor Singh brought out, that how If you look at because one view was that education is part of philosophy's practice, and pedagogy becomes a very central area. And within pedagogy, the role of epics and stories becomes extremely useful. And here is one example that Professor Singh was giving from the Pañcatantra and the Hitopadesha, that how they could be used for philosophical counseling, as it were. I here once again want you to think about a few things about philosophizing about philosophical counseling. What are the kinds of decisions which we have already taken when we start talking about philosophical counseling? One, I think we have taken many decisions in philosophy. One, we have taken a decision that minds exist. Two, we have taken a decision that minds are exhibited in behavior. Three, we have taken a decision that we have a transparent relationship with other minds. Four, we have understood a certain kind of a theory of communication where we think that there is a certain kind of transparent communication which can exist between human beings and which can lead to persuasion. Now, all these theories, as you know, as students and teachers of philosophy, are hugely disputable. So it is only once having taken a certain kind of philosophical decision about other minds, our access to our own mind, our exhibition of minds in particular behaviors being related to our understanding of ourselves and the others, are being entrenched in social political circles, our language being transparently available to each other. These are the kinds of things on which we have already taken a decision before we get into the enterprise of philosophical counseling. So it's not quite a very simple case of the given. What is taken as given in philosophical counseling is also needs a great deal of philosophical clarity. What we found here in Professor R.P. Singh's paper was that if you take philosophical counseling as a case of course correction of people's action, and also as helping people to get out of philosophical perplexity, then what could come as your resource from the ancients? And here he took the resource of the Hitopadesh and the Pañcatantra, which I think are beautiful resources.
Probably we can open the session for question and answers. Friends, if you have any questions, please post them, type them on the chat box, or alternatively, you can even raise your electronic hand so that, yeah, Dr. Rekha, please go ahead.
A very good afternoon and good evening to everyone. And this is in response to Dr. Avaneesh. First of all, I must say that it was a very profound presentation and thoroughly enjoyed it. I just wanted to say that in a way, your paper actually ratified the point that philosophical counseling cannot merely imply a ready reckoner for giving some solutions to people facing existential crisis. And probably, as Professor Singh pointed out, that we can philosophize about many particulars, but in your view, like what I've understood, probably we cannot use philosophical methodology as a panacea in each case. And I would also like to know if there has to be a unique meaning to philosophical counseling in the sense of empathy, in a sense of co-reflecting on an issue, co-traveling on an issue. That's all.
Can I answer?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Rekha, for your kind words. I do not know how to contain the answer. I would try. So I'm not completely averse to philosophizing while doing philosophical counseling, but my paper was predominantly from an academic perspective. So when we are doing philosophizing in the academia, that is quite different from what philosophizing is that is happening inside a counseling setup. But in today, based on my interactions with various persons, there is a confusion. So philosophizing is perceived only as pure, hardcore, methodological philosophizing, which is worthy of publishing as a paper. So as long as it can touch the other person, as long as it can reach the other person, as long as it is accessible to the other person, philosophizing is just another word for me. So I'm not averse to the whole process. I suppose I answered that question.
Actually, if I can just
please.
begin. Yeah, what I wanted to know was the difference between philosophizing and philosophical method. That philosophizing probably would be to just re-echo what Professor Chandra was saying, that philosophizing is probably giving a scheme in that sense. So an academic, a foundational theoretical base. But what probably we are looking at over here is a philosophical methodology, which may be different. So I was just wondering if you were suggesting that in philosophical counseling, we are looking more at the method of philosophizing rather than philosophizing as a person.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I wouldn't even go to the extent of methodology. I would say that counseling has a very vague methodology which we can adapt. I would go with the methods, the specific thoughts from the philosophical schools and how we are applying it, the methods, the techniques, the styles, the innovative ways in which we are applying it to make it relevant to the counseling is what is important to me.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. And about having some unique sense of philosophical empathy, if we can use that word.
So I think we philosophers have a tendency to involve in everything that is there in the universe, you know. So for me, empathy is empathy. There is no philosophical or psychological empathy. We are human beings. Empathizing with the other person is just a person-to-person thing. Whether you are a barber or a philosopher or a doctor, it's just empathy for me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Akshat wants to ask something. Akshat, over to you.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you to all the speakers. My question is to Avaneesh, sir. I completely agree with your proposition that academic philosophy and philosophy as practice should be two different disciplines. And my question is in regard to this. So when you say that the philosophical counselor or practitioner should be able to touch the other person, does that process involve some sort of persuasion or manipulation? And if yes, does that, does that not enable us to come to the question that we are not protecting the autonomy of the counselee? So how do you address that?
Very sensitive question. Again, I'm going to sound like a person who hates philosophers, but still, touching another person. So from my very limited experience of philosophizing and philosophy from the academia, we have a strict sense of puritanism in philosophizing. We don't want to involve any of our personal, subjective, emotional nuances in the process. So I think we just need to remove our straitjacket and be ourselves, and the touching will definitely happen.
And that will not be a sort of a manipulation if you're adding your own subjective experiences as a counselor.
So I would adapt a value from the psychological counseling, which a counselor should possess. It is called congruence. You just need to be yourself. You don't have to be pretentious at all, because the counselee, however intelligent or unintelligent the person is, when we fake it, the person would know. So the fundamental simplest thing is just be yourself. Do not pretend. The counselor's responsibility is not to change the counselee. It is to attempt. It could fail, but it's okay.
Okay, my follow-up question. If it fails in the idea that the counselee attempts suicide, now that isn't that a, don't we need to be cautious about that?
Okay, we definitely have to be cautious. So if the counselor did not preempt that the counselee is going to kill herself or himself, of course it's a fault. So when I say the process can fail, it doesn't mean that one person is meant to be the counselor of another person for the rest of their lives. If a person has a fever and he goes to a general physician and the physician finds out that it's actually related to the heart and an infection which arose from there, they can direct him to a cardiologist. So the job is done there. So it's not failure in that sense. So going to that extreme, of course, suicides might happen, but it's a very hypothetical scenario. So I do not know how to answer that question.
Yeah, that was very,
may I just add a footnote to what has been going on? So not only suicide, even homicide will also happen, and it has happened with many people. Althusser, Foucault, and others, they all had it. The only thing is that don't you think that some kind of interdisciplinary approach could be a healthier perspective between philosophy and psychiatry, counseling and, psychiatry or psychotherapy and philosophy. They can help each other. Just like, you said that a doctor cannot become an engineer. But there are very many ways where a doctor is telling the engineers that I want this kind of an instrument and this way it has to be molded. Engineers have been invited. They took the classes of the doctors and they accordingly they made the surgical tools. So they are together, and there are various such examples even in Charak Samhita, where a patient comes who is a purely vegetarian, but the kind of disease he is suffering from and the kind of treatment he requires, for that the patient is supposed to eat non-veg. So what to do in that case? The patient is strictly vegetarian. So it is suggested that you being a physician or a doctor, so-called, you must be a very good cook also. You should prepare the chicken in such a way that it looks like any kind of vegetables, so that the patient, because your job is to look at the welfare of the patient as a physician or a surgeon or anything of the kind. Yeah. So you have to do that thing. So some kind of interface has to be there instead of creating a binary. Binary could be very disastrous kind of, both in terms of attitude and practice. So, but some kind of, interdisciplinarity can complement in a much better manner. And like if a patient comes with some kind of skepticism is there with the counselor, apprehensions are there, they're trying to know about it, having a dialogue, that's the method that we adopt even in philosophy also. We argue, we discuss, we analyze. Rakesh Chandra is analyzing the concept, what does it mean, analyzing the problems, going into the deeper aspect of it. So these are some of the submissions. That's why I say that philosophy is foundational kind of a thing. Thank you.
I think probably we can have the last question from Dr. Navneet. He has raised his hand. Navneet?
Yeah. I just want to, as Professor Raghavendra Singh, he raised the issue of interdisciplinarity. So it's just a suggestion kind of, that why can't we learn methods and techniques from psychology or psychological counseling? Ultimately, it is the suffering which we want to alleviate. And so it's okay that we do conceptual analysis, maybe a little more rigorously, what psychologists don't do. But since we want to develop this field, I see no harm in adopting insights or methods from psychological counseling, so that we may be a competent counselor. As Avaneesh also pointed out, that philosophical inquiry is a very rigorous inquiry, and not every counselor is capable or might be able to tolerate that kind of rigorous inquiry. And many times it's just a problem at emotional or affective level. And just think of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or this narcissism and all that. People are rational here, but they know that they are doing is irrational. I mean, someone who is washing his hand 100 times in a day, do you think he doesn't know that this is irrational? He knows, and he is helpless. So if we want to be really effective, I think we should increase our repertoire, and interdisciplinarity should be encouraged. That's my
yes. Of course, I fully agree with you that we have to take it up, and not only from psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and other things, and from other disciplines also, economics, political science, anthropology. That's why interdisciplinarity doesn't mean that I'm sticking to philosophy only as the umbrella concept within which everything else has to come. In fact, philosophy has to share its ideas, be open to all those scrutiny, examinations. And indeed, in fact, when Avaneesh was speaking, I was very much fascinated by his lecture and the way he was convinced about it. So that was very illuminating, and you can see the compliments.
Yeah, I think we are coming.
Yeah. So this is that's all.
Yeah, we are coming to the end of this session because we just have 1 more minute to proceed to the other session. Professor Rakesh, would you like to give your 1 minute remarks so that we can proceed to the next session?
Thank you very much. I think it has been a very useful session.
You have the last word.
Yeah. Thank you. I thank the speakers for their very well thought out, well presented scholarly presentations. And as a philosophy teacher, I really am very impressed by the kind of interrelationality that you are able to see. I once again want to call your attention to the fact that as philosophers, intellectual modesty is not the only virtue that you need to cultivate. Intellectual honesty and intellectual modesty go hand in hand. And as Avaneesh was saying, it's important for us to understand the limits of philosophical inquiry, if it is understood as a second order inquiry, or as what the analyst said, that mainly terminological clarification and understanding and meaning analysis remains the task of philosophy in a certain view. Of course, you have the overarching view as well. We are delighted to have so many perspectives on that. But yet, how would philosophical counseling be different from the others? And when we talk about interdisciplinarity, what would be the cartography that we first mark out before we move from one to the other? And what would be the gains from each other would be very important. Thank you very much. I thank Professor Balaganpati for giving me this opportunity to listen to these very, very brilliant papers and hope that we'll continue to be educated in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I would also like to thank all our speakers, Dr. Enakshi Ray, Avaneesh, and Professor Singh. And once again, thanks Professor Rakesh Chandra for being the chair. Thank you very much. This session, we now move on to the next session.